The dust has settled. The 2022 NFL draft is now over. And I know some of you already mock drafting 2023. So pump the brakes a bit, a little early to do that. But it's also kind of early to evaluate a draft class. You kind of need to see them on the field and then really be able to do that years later. But nonetheless, we're going to offer our evaluation and letter grade of the Steelers 2022 draft class right here on this episode of Draft Talk, of course, on Pittsburgh Sports Live, Steelers Now, and all throughout our Sports Now family of networks. Since when it's a draft, it touches college sports as well. I'm Mike Asti. That is Nick Farabaugh. Nick's been with me throughout all of our show coverage of this NFL draft. And of course, that goes to the Steelers getting their QB1 with Kenny Pickett at 20 overall and then onward from there. So, Nick, it's time to kind of wrap things up here. We got your reaction to a lot of the early round selections. All that video reaction and show reaction is on PSL and other sites. So before we give our full letter grade and maybe if anything changed for you in terms of your evaluation of Pickett or Pickens or any of the early round picks from round 4 onward, did anything stand out for you in terms of a player selected? What will be a player that stood out from those later round picks that actually could have an impact that maybe you were surprised by the Steelers actually taking, whether you maybe you don't like the selection of anything that stood out in those later rounds?
Well, I think the obvious one's Calvin Austin. I think that pick is really a great value pick. Quite honestly, a guy you didn't expect to be there at 138, just because of his speed. I mean, he has deadly speed, and we're not talking about a guy that comes into the NFL and hasn't done receiver things. You know, he is that kind of running back wide receiver dual thing that you have. He's had a lot of carries, and he's done a lot of that, and he's been very effective on that. But he's a guy that has legitimate route running chops, is good off the line of scrimmage. He plays big for his size, and by that I mean he plays with physicality. He's not going to necessarily, play smaller. He's going to make sure you're going to feel it. Is the cool thing about him. And yeah, he does have some issues. Obviously, the size, it is going to matter a little bit. Not going to have a huge catch radius. You're not going to have a huge window to fit it in there. But good news for him, Kenny Pickett's one of the most accurate quarterbacks in the draft. So you got the accurate guy to work with there. And so I think Calvin Austin's going to add a different dimension to kind of what you get, because you have a guy that works both inside and outside with his speed, and a guy that can really stretch the field. They just don't have this type of speed in that room. They don't have 4.32 speed in that room right now. So he's going to add another dimension. And you also see those jet sweeps Matt Canada does, can get a lot of those manufactured touches underneath, make things a lot easier for Kenny Pickett, can be used in a lot of different ways, can get those jet sweeps. He's going to be a guy that I think adds another dimension to this offense. And now you're 4 deep at receiver, and I think you're feeling a lot better about yourself, because that Calvin Austin pick, man, I mean, it just adds a different type of dimension. And sometimes you see guys run 4.32 and you're like, they don't play like that. Austin plays 4.32. I mean, you see the speed on tape. So it's a good pick, and I think it stands out as a great value pick. And I think the Steelers really revamped this receiving core. Quite honestly, if they sign Deontay Johnson next year, they don't have to touch this position for another 2 years.
Yeah, and even if they don't, they have some safety net cushion by not doing so until having George Pickens and now having another burner behind him. And obviously they can dip back in the receiver well next year if they really have to, if the things with Deontay explode. Mike Asti, Nick Farabaugh. I like the Calvin Austin pick as well, especially with him able to take the top off the defense, not being pressured to do too much early on with Pickens there and with Deontay Johnson still there. And you're obviously helping a quarterback fits in with Pickett for the future. But the pushback, I guess, and one of the pushbacks of the Steelers' first 4 or 5 rounds is they addressed the depth at receiver. They needed to address the depth at receiver. They addressed QB for the future. They addressed even the D-line, which had question marks, and we've talked on other shows, and they needed to improve there. But they didn't address the offensive line. And I think everyone would agree that if the offensive line is completely awful again, it doesn't matter who's at QB or what else is going on, you're going to struggle on offense, even with maybe a more mobile QB. So any thoughts on the Steelers not going offensive line when maybe they could have in some of those earlier rounds, especially with the Calvin Austin pick, because that really adds depth. That's a great selection. It's great value, but maybe some wanted them to go offensive line there after they addressed the D-line and after they already addressed receiver. It does look like offensive line is still a problem unless it improves from last year with the current players. And if not, it could kind of screw the first few rounds of this draft, even though most people like the picks.
I mean, I would have liked it. I just don't think the value was there. There was a run
Okay.
on offensive tackles early on. I don't think it made sense to add an interior O lineman here. If you weren't going to add an interior O lineman early, I just didn't feel a reason there was any to add any at all. I think you have those guys on the roster already. You have Hasner, you have Leglue. You
Okay.
have those guys that have.
So you
shown
like them enough?
I like them as depth. I don't because if you're being drafted in round 4, you're not coming in to be a starter.
Yeah, they don't have a chance at the top O line.
Yeah.
Right.
So, if you were in the first round and you drafted like Linderbaum, that's a different story because he's got a chance to start, right? So honestly, and Kendrick Green's still there too. Let's not forget about him. I know he was bad last year, and people are going to be saying move on, but it was 1 year for a 3rd round pick that was thrown right into a fire at a position he had played 4 games at the collegiate level.
100%.
Let's have some patience with Kendrick Green for just a little bit. If he doesn't show up this year, then next year we're talking about more interior alignment. But they re-signed Chooks. Dan Moore's coming off a fine season as a 4th round pick. I think they still need another tackle. I do think that, but I'm guessing that's going to come from some free agency here. Just Joe Haig as a swing tackle right now. They do need another tackle, but I think that the value wasn't there in the tackles. I think that they thought maybe they would have better chance at getting one sometime in that round 4 area, and none of them fell to them. So it was just better just to go with the obvious value pick. And so, offensive line, it's still an issue, but I think that the Steelers invested in that room. They brought in James Daniels, brought in Mason Cole, re-signed Chooks. And so essentially on the tackle spot, you're kicking it down the road, but you're trying to see, is Dan Moore or Chooks one of the answers? Because you can keep saying we keep drafting this position, but these guys are young, and Dan Moore's in his 2nd year. Kendrick Green's in his 2nd year. Dotson's in his 3rd year, right? I mean, these are young guys. So we can't just say year 2, that guy's a bust, because offensive line is not an easy position to transition from. You see guys that come into the league and play great at that position. They're the exception. They are not the rule. So let's have a little bit of patience with the O-line. I'm not saying it's going to be good this year. I definitely could see why people are concerned with it, but really you have depth already at the interior spots. So the guy you would draft this late isn't going to make a lot of noise. And then tackle, you could have argued, they should have gotten one maybe later, but I think in round 4, you look at the board, the value just was not there. So why would you pass up the dude who runs the 4-3-2 and can add another dimension to your offense? In fact, I think if there's any criticism to have about this pick with Calvin Austin, it's that the fact that they didn't go cornerback.
That's another direction.
I think that's kind of the bigger thing is that they didn't run the DBs at all, and this was a deep corner class, and with the way they had shown interest, you thought they're going to get into this muck a little bit. They just didn't draft a DB, and so you have 3-4 solid DBs. They fixed the safety position by signing DeMonte Casey, but you don't really have great outside corner depth. What happens if Levi Wallace or Akello Witherspoon go down? So now you have to move Cam Sutton back out, and then in the slot, it's Mollett and Norwood again, and you're kind of back where you were last year. So this is the question of what do they do at corner? Do they just run with the guys they have? Is a Joe Hayden reunion coming up?
I was going to say, you don't have the 8 games from Joe Hayden after he comes back from injury, because he always misses some games. And at the end of the year, Joe Hayden usually is ready to go and making plays, but you're not going to have that unless you somehow get that and bring him back, because he has certainly been tasting some humble pie since it felt like his Steelers time would end. Nick Farabaugh, Mike Asti. That's absolutely a fair point, because I think entering the draft, people wanted them to replace QB, obviously depth at receiver. Offensive line has always been a thing for 2 years, but then secondary and defensive line might even have been even, because you're getting older or you have inconsistency and question marks at both of those 2 spots. They do go D-line with DeMarvin Leal, who we touched on a past show, just reacting to that pick, but they don't really go anything in the secondary. And that is something. It pretty much was a mostly offensive draft. It was an 80% offensive driven draft. Today's NFL, you do win an offense. There have been teams to win championships, pretty much just outscoring clubs. I'm not saying you want to do that. They want to get pressure. They do want to have the defensive numbers be better than what the perception of the defense is, because nationally people think the defense is good, but they haven't really shown up and put the numbers up, just besides sacks the last couple of years. but I don't know if you could pass up on the players that they took in those spots. They let the draft fall to them. They didn't have to give up anything. They didn't have to do a crazy trade to get their QB1. And yeah, again, when you bring in Calvin Austin, it's hard to pass up on him with that talent, with that value. And you're not going to go offensive line in those later rounds. I think people don't get what maybe the criticism could be. And Nick, this argument will maybe never die 5 years from now. If Najee Harris has a solid career, but they don't win and they don't make the playoffs, or he leaves in his second deal after his rookie deal expires, people will then say the problem is they should have won offensive line in an early round instead of him, because then you could get a player that could have played right away. That was maybe an Orlando Pace comparison where you can play right away when you're that high level of an offensive line pick, but not in these later rounds. So once you didn't do that and you bring in Najee and he's there, you build the weapons, and you're not going to get that guy, that Orlando Pace guy, in the fourth round. Outside of the Calvin Austin pick and outside of, again, the early round picks here, Conor Hayward was selected by the Pittsburgh Steelers. That obviously has a very familiar name to him there. Obviously, Cam very excited about it. There are some, and I've seen this nationally, that are going to say that, okay, the Steelers didn't just take Pickett because he went to Pitt. They took him because he was their QB1. They love him. And if he went to West Virginia, Penn State, or anywhere other school, they would have still taken him. They just love Kenny Pickett. But maybe there was a personal connection to the Conor Hayward pick when he was taken. He certainly brings some help to the team. How does Conor Hayward fit to this team? And what are your thoughts on that pick? And if his last name bumped him to be any type of, well, we don't know here, so we'll take him because this is Conor Hayward.
Well, I think certainly that's part of it. I certainly think that the fact that he's Cam's brother, they like the brother connection.
Yeah, they have three of them on the team, right?
Yeah, I mean, so they like the brother stuff. So I mean, it's part of it probably. It's some locker room philosophy that they have that they think it helps. I'm certain that helped. I also do think that Conor Hayward is going to allow them to do some things. First of all, they did need tight end depth, and he's going to be a tight end. I'll say this. I think people talk about him and Watt as the same player, and I don't think they are. Okay. I think they're different players in regards. So Hayward's 5'11", and this is the interesting thing, because Alfredo Roberts said he's not going to be a fullback. He's going to be a tight end at 5'11". That's interesting. You don't see many tight ends that small. But so what you're going to see him doing is H-back stuff. So he's going to be that end man on that line of scrimmage, trying to maybe pull over and bring that, the blocks in. He could be a wing guy that gets some jet sweeps in the goal line. I think that's where you might see him used, down inside the 5, where you can maybe get him some jet sweeps and let him kind of just use his physicality and use his body to do that. I think the one cool thing about Conor Hayward is that he's such a short-handed player. You see all over his tape that even when he gets hit hard in contested spots, he hangs on. I mean, his success rate in contested catches is unreal. So I kind of look at him as this tight end 3 that you can use in some useful ways. Obviously, I think this pick's partially motivated by special teams, because this is where he's going to be really good. Conor Hayward's an exceptional teams player, and the Steelers
certainly right away that round. Yeah,
that's his immediate impact. And so the Steelers are going to be searching for team's impact. And so I look at Hayward and I say that's why he was primarily drafted. I think they have some cool things to use with him. I think he's going to be the tight end 3, but I also don't think it's necessarily a wasted pick, because again, in round 6, if the guy turns into a really good special teamer, it's a win. It's round 6 as a 6th round pick. Right. I mean, it's really nothing crazy.
That's where you can have some fun. If you do have a family connection and he's a good player, it's not like you're just picking up a scrap heap. It's not the end of the world if he ends up not working out at 6th or 7th round, and maybe they did bump him a little bit because of the last name, because of the brother connection with Cam. Cam seems excited. He's at least, there's not going to be any off the field problems. You're going to get I think part of why maybe they like the brother thing, and certainly the jury is out on whether they are getting production of Derek Watt or not. That is a debate, but you do figure when you have a late round guy or maybe a non-superstar guy, like they brought in Derek Watt from another team, paired with a brother who is a superstar like TJ and Cam in particular, you're going to get the most out of the non-star, because they're going to have that one-on-one work with a Hall of Famer that isn't going to always be there for a 6th-round pick. I'm not saying Cam wouldn't mentor a 6th-round pick, and obviously they play different positions, but I could certainly see Cam providing some tutelage to his brother that a player who's not playing his position on the other side of the ball late rounds probably wouldn't receive. So that's good. I mean, there's no negatives there, even if it's off the field stuff. And yeah, locker room continuity and chemistry certainly works as well. Is there anything, though, outside of just those picks, outside of, obviously the Steelers do get a linebacker there in the 7th round. Anything else that stands out, maybe even that pick there in the 7th round to you out of this draft for the Steelers? Because it does, again, appear like they got a lot of positions of need. They let these picks fall to them. They got some guys they like. There's also some connections there that they like. But there's still some holes on this roster. There's still some problems on this team. This roster is not perfect, even with the fact that it does universally feel like most people are liking this draft by the Steelers.
Yeah, well, I think the late 7th round picks are kind of interesting. I think the linebacker and Mark Robinson makes sense. Needs some more linebacker depth. He's a guy that's vocal. He's a guy that's more of a downhill player. Screams to me Robert Spillane replacement, to be quite honest with you, because Spillane's going to be he's going to be an unrestricted free agent next year. I'm not sure if they're going to want to bring him back on a heftier price tag. So We'll see about that. I think right away he's kind of that vocal leader you have. Big time physical upside though. Has only played linebacker for 1 season. So he switched over from running back. Former running back. You don't see this switch a lot. You don't see the running back to linebacker transfer.
And that was actually another thing people brought up as maybe a pushback is the Steelers maybe should have went to running back and looked for running back depth because you have Najee. He's getting beat up with a bad O-line. Clearly, Benny Snell hasn't worked out in others. Generally, championship teams have multiple running backs that they use throughout a year that are solid and get you 500 plus yards. Do they have that behind Najee is a question.
Yeah, well, that's the question. And that is, I think, a valid criticism here is that you needed that running back. Now they go outside in the UFA process, Mateo Durant and Jalen Warren. Expect one of those two to make the roster, in my opinion. But yeah, I mean, I would have liked them to have drafted one, although the running backs here on day 3 came off a lot faster than I thought they would. But there was still depth there. I think there were still guys there you could have taken a chance on and draft. So I would have liked to see them draft one. And that might be where, I have an issue with the Chris Oladokun pick. 2 quarterbacks is kind of interesting. Now I get why they drafted Oladokun. They like him. They like his traits a lot. Big arm, athletic, tough as heck. I mean, the guy's tough as nails. So he fits kind of the Mike Tomlin mold of quarterback. He's going to be able to be move, make things happen. More of a runner than Kenny Pickett, but a lot of the similar ways. Bigger arm too, but again, similar type of player, really raw, but I get what they wanted to do. He's an upside pick in the 7th round.
Yeah.
He's got that upside. And so when you have Mason Rudolph now essentially being paid so much money to potentially be the 3rd string, now you kind of, your ears perk up and you say, okay, does this mean Mason Rudolph's done here in Pittsburgh? And does this mean Oladokun's going to take that QB3 spot?
Well,
I think it's possible.
Yeah, so you're reading my mind actually here. Mike Asti, Nick Farabaugh, as we're recapping the 2022 NFL draft here on PSL Steelers Now and throughout our Sports Now network. That, I would say, and the joke is out there, it's kind of true, the biggest loser of this draft might actually have been Mason Rudolph, who finally thought he had a chance. Ben retires, Dwayne Haskins passes away tragically. Those 2 guys were basically either his competition in Dwayne or Ben, who was in front of him, that he couldn't solidify anything with them there. They're now both not going to be there. And yet you bring in Mitch Trubisky, who, in terms of realistic moves outside Hall of Famers and Pro Bowlers, he was a legit veteran to bring in, a former Pro Bowl actually himself, former top round pick. That's a solid choice, and that's a bridge QB that could have had them wait. You talked about your initial reaction was maybe you don't bring in Pickett because you do have him. You wait and have the ceiling of Malik Willis. That would be the argument. You bring in a QB1 NFL ready in Kenny Pickett, who's not going to really want to wait, or they're not going to have him wait 2 or 3 years because then he'd be the same age as Mr. Trubisky right now at 24. So that does feel like Mason Rudolph. If I'm him and I'm his agent, I almost would request a trade, because they're not going to have him. It's very unlikely he's going to start at any time, let alone this coming season. And if he doesn't, then if you're the Steelers, I guess this is the question. if you're the Steelers, because of drafting a second quarterback and having now 4, does this actually tip your hand a little bit? And the negative of drafting a young QB as a second QB in your single draft, and maybe you like the ceiling, but now there's pressure that they basically have to trade Mason Rudolph for some value, because after you have your camp battle, you're not going to keep him as a QB3. That would be a little weird. You want to get value for him. So there's pressure to do that. And is that what you feel is going to happen? Is there a chance the other second QB taken in the 7th round will actually make this roster? Or if they don't get value for Mason, say they don't get at least a 5th round pick for Mason, is there any chance they sit and say to themselves, we're not trading a legit backup in this NFL, as there are so few of them, who has started, for a 7th round pick? So we will keep Mason as long as he doesn't complain. And then obviously that other QB is off the roster. What's going to happen here? What's your prediction? 4 QBs right now. One of them is a ceiling project. One of them is NFL ready. 2 of them are veterans. One of them started and done it before. The other one's Mason Rudolph, who's started some games, but mostly a backup. Is Mason Rudolph out? What value can they get? And then who do you think is the QB3 entering the season?
Well, I think there's a few ways to look at this. First of all, I think that they should shop Mason around. I think that's the right move. See if you can get anything for him.
Now or after the camp battle? Like, do they really
right
have him compete? Because it doesn't feel like that. I kind of feel like that's stupid.
I would do it right now. I would shop him.
Right.
Now, I think that I think they'll keep him through camp. They need to. They always bring 4 quarterbacks to camp.
That's true.
It's a norm.
They've done that before.
So, if Mason doesn't show anything in camp or whatever, or if he has an unexpected camp, I think you then can trade.
What if he's lights out in camp? What do? You have Kenny that you drafted in the 1st round. Mitch is a veteran who's not going to just completely suck. I feel like even if Mason is dominant in camp and makes the people who hate him apologize, you're still not going to use him, right? Like,
no, I think at that point you're looking at, say, okay, he's having good preseason games, and then you're shopping him around to the other teams saying, look at this.
Value. Yeah.
Like, that's what true. I think. So I think that's why the Steelers will keep him, because if he has a good preseason, well, they can start shopping him around for 5th, 6th round pick, right? And so I think that's what you would look for. I think that's what, there's teams out there that need a backup quarterback.
Yeah. Oh, sure. He's going to be in the NFL. Yeah.
So this is why I think you would shop him around. I think that's what would happen. You would look at your roster and say, okay, as long as Aladakun is showing some good signs, then you go with them, and I think that's what's going to end up happening, because I think they could stash Aladakun on the practice squad, but anytime you put him there, it's always a risk of him potentially getting picked. Now they could protect him only so. Now remember, they can only protect him so much, right?
Yeah.
So you kind of got to look at that and say, do we want to risk this guy, this young quarterback, who I think they drafted Aladakun in the vein of, okay, Mitch has a 2-year deal. We're giving him 1 to 2 years to develop, and then he can be Kenny's backup. Now, that's what I think ends up happening.
Unless he's so good. I mean, obviously, that maybe would be their perfect world.
I think that's the plan. Unless, who knows, maybe Aladakun turns into something more than they ever thought, right?
Well, I was going to say, what if Mitch Trubisky leads them to a wild card berth this year?
Well, and that could be the different wrinkle, right?
It's not out of the question. 8 or 9 wins could get him in. There's a lot of
Alan and I were talking about this too on Draft Talk. It's like, okay, what happens if Mitch ends up being legitimately good? And I'm not just saying leading them to a playoff position or whatever. Is he actually legitimately good? Like, if he ends up being legitimately good, then what? So it's a question, right? And then I just said, well, look at Kenny Pickett. He's almost 24 years old. Mitchell Trubisky is not that old. He's only 27. He's going to be in his age 28 season this year. So at that point, if Mitch Trubisky has a good year and then he doubles down on it, I think the answer is obvious. You extend Mitch Trubisky and you trade Kenny Pickett, in which case, that would kind of suck. But that's
that would be controversial. But I mean, Mitch Trubisky's not that old.
Yeah, it would suck. It'd be a wasted 1st round pick. Right. But guess what? You spent the 20th overall pick on a quarterback. It's really not that steep of a price to pay for a lot of the quarterbacks. And you still have your answer of the future, right? I mean, no one's going to complain if Mitch Trubisky's the answer. You're really just you're just really recouping value. And you really can't blame them for drafting Kenny Pickett, because Mitch Trubisky has never shown he can be the answer. So if that's the case, really, they just got their answer of the future and they get more draft capital on his backup, and then Oladipo steps in. Now, that's not what I expect to happen. What I expect to happen is Kenny Pickett starts and Oladipo is the backup of the future. Doesn't mean that Mitch won't start this year, but I think that your future look is, okay, 1 and 2 are Kenny Pickett and Chris Oladipo. I think that's your future quarterback room. And so I think this year you're trying to move Mason in some way. They could end up cutting him after everything if he ends up being bad. And I think you kind of rallied out however it works out. And then you let Kenny, Mitch, whoever starts, kind of work it out and you go from there.
Yeah, and Mason could easily, that's why some call him mediocre Mason. He could easily have a really bad camp. Maybe even you have to think of this too. He might be just so PO'd that's hard to, it's very unlikely maybe that he's going to have a lights out camp, or maybe he's motivated and that means he's going to have a great camp. Who knows? It can go one way or the other with Mason Rudolph, but I think no matter what it goes, that'll just to change the value you get for him. If he really, really sucks, then you just got to probably cut bait or maybe try for a 7th round pick because he does have a body of work that's at least good enough to be a backup. I mean, name me 5 backups that you feel can start 2 games and win them in the NFL. Not many. Mason could probably do that. So I think he's going to be in the NFL. I would be shocked if he's in like the USFL or something. He's an NFL quarterback, no matter that some hate him.
Mm-hmm.
And Mitch Trubisky, 27 years old. Kenny's 24. I think what you're saying makes sense. I do wonder because of what they've said, and we also agree that they don't lie about draft prospects. They do love Kenny Pickett so much. Mike Tomlin literally was like Matthew McConaughey giving you the all right, and was jumping to the phone to call him. He was their QB1. It didn't matter whether Malik Willis was obviously still there, and they could have picked anybody. So I do wonder, what's the bar? I guess what's the bar to have your scenario occur? If they happen to get in the playoffs, because Mitch Trubisky, who you're saying hasn't done it before, has led a team to the playoffs as a starter for most of the games, has made a Pro Bowl as a starter while playing most of the games. Doesn't mean that he was great or elite or franchise guy, but if he has that same season he had with the Bears a couple years ago, and you win 9 games and you're a wild card team, and you basically do the same thing that you've done the last several years and you're ceiling with Ben the last 3 or 4, or maybe you win a playoff game or whatever. Maybe you compete for the division if the Bengals take a step back and the Ravens are kind of floundering. But Mitch, you don't feel like is better than Pickett? Because I guess the devil's advocate stance, Nick, is going to be, even if Mitch is good enough for you that you make him your starter and then you're trading Kenny Pickett, and Kenny Pickett, who is NFL ready to many and is good somewhere else, and say, for example, the exact scenario you're saying for history buffs out there who love sports history is literally Brett Favre, drafted by the Atlanta Falcons in the early 90s and 91. They mispronounced his name and all that. They didn't really feel a connection to him. The head coach didn't like him. It wasn't working out there. They weren't going anywhere though, really, as a team with the whole Deion situation. And they got him out of there. He went to Green Bay and then became a legend, became a Hall of Famer. It's not like if that happens to Pickett, he can't still have time to be a good quarterback. But if he does the Brett Favre thing and becomes a Pro Bowler or, God forbid, a Hall of Famer elsewhere, you're always going to have Steelers fans that are going to say, you let him get away after drafting him. And imagine if it's not like Brett Favre was from Atlanta in terms of playing college ball. So that would be a dire situation as well. That almost would be the second worst scenario, as if you passed on him in the draft and he became a great player, like with Dan Marino. So imagine how polarizing that would be. That would be heavily criticized if he has a great career and Mitch Trubisky has a good year this year, but doesn't keep on doing it because he is a little bit older and hasn't done it before. That's a gigantic risk. You'd have to bet on Mitch Trubisky. I think you have to tread lightly in the next 5 years.
That's why you have to tread lightly with Mitch. And that's the thing. Again, we're talking about a guy that has 5 NFL seasons on his resume. He has 5 NFL seasons of tape on his resume. Kenny Pickett has a good old goose egg on that regard.
True.
So we know what Mitch Trubisky is. We think we do. You can. The question is, and I think this is where it becomes interesting. If Mitch Trubisky becomes the next Ryan Tannehill, this is where it becomes interesting.
Yeah.
If Mitch Trubisky has a Ryan Tannehill-like
good enough
ascension,
right?
If he comes back from the dead, if you will, and comes back and becomes Ryan Tannehill 2.0 in this offense, then what do you do? That's where it becomes interesting, because the question is going to be, well, Mitch now actually has good ball in him, but then there's these past 5 seasons where he hasn't played good, And now Tennessee is still cruising along with Ryan Tannehill, but they're paying him a huge deal. They just drafted Malik Willis,
Yeah.
and they're looking to upgrade on Ryan Tannehill.
Who's more of a
like
project, though, where Kenny Pickett's more NFL ready. That's the difference. That's why the
exactly.
Steelers didn't
So
go Malik Willis.
it becomes interesting at that point, because if he becomes the next Ryan Tannehill, you have a guy that can lead you to multiple playoff appearances, you feel. But the difference is you also have this young guy in Kenny Pickett who you don't know what he is technically at the NFL level. Now, he could be another Tannehill-ish player, Trubisky-ish player, and maybe that's what he is. But he could also be Derek Carr or Dak Prescott or something like this. Like those are his. I talked with Alan and I said, his two high-end projections are Dak Prescott and Derek Carr. Like those are Kenny's high-end.
They're really good projections. They're not Hall of Famers, but they're really good.
They're really good players. And so if that's what he turns into, the answer is obvious. It's Kenny Pickett. But you gotta the difference is gonna be is what do you do if Mitch is that Ryan Tannehill like player?
You won't see Pickett on the field. So like you aren't going to be able to, when you make that decision next year based on your scenario, you're going to be betting on how good Mitch is in the future versus what you think about Pickett without actually seeing him play in the NFL, unless he has a spot start or so, but it wouldn't be for an entire season. You're going to have growing pains as a rookie. Your scenario, the other one popped in my head for more recent NFL fans, you would basically have the San Francisco 49ers scenario. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying Jimmy G is maybe as good as what you're saying, but he has led a team to the Super Bowl. He has led a team to multiple championship game appearances, to multiple playoff appearances. If you get to Mitch being Jimmy G, where you can win and go deep into the postseason, and he's at least better than Jimmy G on the field, it is a risk to give that up for a young kid, because even though he's the Pitt kid and you would have people really mad if he has a great career in the future, imagine those same people if you gave up on Mitch and then Kenny gets in there and just completely busts and sucks, or is your Teddy Bridgewater or lower comparison, which is not as good probably as what Mitch could be, or maybe even has been really. I mean, that's kind of similar. Then you're going to have people saying, well, you should have kept Mitch. He was better. So you kept the hometown kid and that was wrong, because you could have certainly traded Mitch for value if he would.
And again, that becomes a conundrum.
It's a little bit of a conundrum. It's going to be fun for us to talk about here, but it will be.
It becomes a tough scenario, because Tannehill and Garoppolo, Tannehill has taken his team to an AFC championship. Garoppolo's taken his team to multiple AFC championships, NFC championships rather, and a Super Bowl.
Right.
So Jared Goff took his team to a Super Bowl. Yeah. So we're talking about guys in that.
And they did get rid of him.
That. Yeah. And if Mitch is that, I mean, he's not as good as Herbert, Mahomes, Allen, all these guys, but we've proven in the NFL, those guys can win. And if you build a good roster around them, they can win. And so it's kind of tough, because theoretically, and this is also going to come into comparison, if you think Kenny's that type of player, well, Mitch after 2 years is going to want 30, 40 million.
Yeah,
and
it's a lot for Mitch, right?
Yeah, and meanwhile, Kenny's going to be on his rookie deal. So if you think Kenny's going to be equal to that or better, you move on from Mitch. And that's the thing. It could be a tough scenario. It could be a tough scenario. But right now, I think, it's going to all be about kind of how this competition goes. Because I think if Kenny Pickett has a good enough camp, I think we could see him be the week one starter. So I don't think
that would be something.
I don't think it's a crazy proposition to say Kenny Pickett could start week one. I would put Mitch as maybe the slight favorite right now. Don't count out Kenny Pickett, man. Don't count him.
No, he's been counted out before. Hey, if they're being honest, Pitt fans didn't even like him 2-3 years ago. He had to get over adversity there. He had to become what he became at Pitt. And then, I'm not counting Kenny Pickett out, but it is a month ago or 2 months ago, people thought the Steelers had really no one that anybody loved at quarterback after Ben, and a lot of question marks. And then now there's arguments to be made. They have two guys that people can be comfortable with for next season or beyond. It would also argue that if you have Kenny Pickett start week one, and we'll get into this on future shows, so we're going to transition and close up shop here. But if you do have Kenny Pickett start week one, there's a legit argument that bringing in Mitch Trubisky then was a little bit pointless for this year. If you don't let him to at least start the beginning of this season, if he doesn't start week one, that is like what then was the point. And maybe you could trade him for value or something though this year, because he has done enough. And there is an argument in favor of Mitch that you're saying we already know what he is for 5 years. You could argue this is the best roster he will ever have had. Maybe with Stephon Diggs in 1 or 2 games with Buffalo, but he was the backup to Josh Allen. He didn't have a better roster with the Bears, and he did take them to the playoffs. So he did it with a worse roster. I don't think anyone should bet on that Mitch Trubisky is just going to flat out suck. I think there will have to be a little bit of a debate out there. But Nick, as we do round things out here, overall, give me your grade for the Steelers 2022 draft class. Obviously, it starts at Pickett, goes to Pickens. DeMar Leal does go defensive line. You have Calvin Austin the third. You have Conor Hayward. You go to Marcus Robinson at the linebacker, get another quarterback in there. A lot of people like the draft. You're seeing a lot of A's out there. I will tip my hand on Mike Drop. I did a show. I kind of went A. It's hard to go A+ or A++, but it's hard to hate on it too much. What's your letter grade for this draft class as we stand now, knowing all those question marks? Because a lot of this depends on the future and how they play, how other people play, what happens around them. If Malik Willis ends up killing it, that would be controversial. But what's your letter grade on this Steelers draft class now?
B+ is my letter grade. So I think I love the Pickens pick. I love the Austin pick. I love the upside of Leal. I think the last 3 picks are okay. I don't love them. And the one I'm a little concerned about Kenny Pickett's lack of ceiling. Again, we're talking about Pickett and Mitch. They could become the Tannehill types, but I don't know if you're going to win with that in this AFC with all these great quarterbacks. That's the issue I have kind of with that all with Burrow, Lamar, and Deshaun Watson in the division. It's a tough kind of ask, and then you have Mahomes, Herbert, Allen all outside of it. Even Matt Ryan at that. So you have a ton of good quarterbacks outside of that kind of sphere, if you will. So that's my one thing. It's the lack of a ceiling with Kenny Pickett. Again, I like the fit with Kenny. I just worry that it's not going to be as fruitful as they think, but they're going to have to develop him into that Derek Carr, Dak-ish tier. And if they can get him to that, and that is his ceiling, again, his mid-comp's kind of Teddy Bridgewater, but if he can improve, and if he can improve a little bit, because he does have things to work on, he's not, just because he is pro ready and doesn't have a ton of upside doesn't mean he can't be a good quarterback. That is his ceiling. I said his ceiling is like Derek Carr, Dak Prescott type of player. Right. And if that's what he can develop into, and I think he's in a really good situation to potentially develop into that. I really do. I think, especially because of the leap he took from 2020 to 2021, it was night and day. People are like, okay, he's a 5th-year senior going against, these guys. No, he like legitimately took huge leaps last year. So if he takes another one of those huge leaps, we're not talking about Teddy Bridgewater anymore. We're talking about that Derek Carr, Dak Prescott type of player. And that, folks, is where I think you can see Kenny kind of really come into his own and become a really good pick. It's just going to be the question of, can you get to that? And I think that's why I just hold it back a little bit from being B+, but from being any more than a B+. I think if it was an A, I would have probably given them an A- if they had taken Malik Willis, because I'd like to bet on the upside. I think Kenny, though, is probably the second best quarterback in the class. I think it's a fine pick. It's just not a great pick. But I think they crushed rounds 2 through 4. I really think that was a really great 3 stretch pick. Right. Again, I don't hate the last 3. I just think that they're just okay. But I think B+. I think this is a strong draft for the Steelers.
And it's interesting because there are a lot of people who do believe that if your first round pick is not an A, it's hard to give the overall draft an A, but you're giving the first round pick more of a B and the rest of it an A, and still able to come to an A overall, because I guess the B could get to an A. So it's different math and different ways you slice it there. And the Malik Willis situation, many did want to bet on a higher ceiling because you have a bridge. And if you would have drafted Malik Willis, Nick, the last 10 minutes of the show would have been kind of irrelevant. You would not think he'd be ready now or even next year. Probably your Mitch 2-year contract would be when Mitch plays. And then after 2 years, then you make a decision. And maybe even then Malik's not ready. So it wouldn't be as pressing and the age is different. It wouldn't be as pressing of a controversial quarterback thing as by having Pickett there, who you can't wait until Pickett's 28 years old before you make a decision on Pickett. Then you're screwing him. So it is a little bit more pressing, a little different. He's more NFL ready. It'll be interesting. This is going to be polarizing and tons of conversation that are going to come from this as well. There are different things they could have done. I do think A myself. So you went B+. It wasn't A+. I thought you said that initially. You went B+. Okay. So B+ is still pretty good. This is one of the few drafts I can remember in a while that it feels like most media and fans kind of agree that it's a good one. I mean, there's been a lot of drafts where a lot of people were negative. A lot of negativity always around picks, but I think Kevin Colbert's swan song was actually one of his better drafts of his entire 20-year tenure that certainly could get him in the Hall of Fame someday. So that is absolutely saying something, to say the least. Nick Farabaugh, Mike Asti. That'll do it. It's our evaluation of the 2022 NFL draft for the Steelers, our draft grades and what we think of those picks. And we really won't know if we're right or wrong for a while, but we gave it to you nonetheless, because that's what we got to do here. Again, subscribe, comment below on PSL, and then also hit us up at Steelers Now.